further 35,000 fled to Hungary. Romania, Slovakia and Moldova are also seeing a huge number of people crossing the border. Shona Murray reports from Bucharest.
As Ukrainians flee to escape war, the EU's Home Affairs Commissioner Ylva Johansson says it's preparing for the arrival of millions of civilians from there. Romania, which borders Ukraine, is one of the countries bearing the responsibility of this new refugee wave. Svetlana, who's 25, is one of the many who has had to find protection across the border.
It makes me want to cry all the time because I see what's happening in other regions. In our it's quiet, but there's people dying and children dying. I can't believe it, and they have the audacity to say that it was us.
Local Romanians are coming from far and wide to help officials handle the influx of people from Ukraine. Warm drinks and food is being provided for refugees, but the volunteers here say it's not easy.
It's very overwhelming because most of us stay home in the heat, and they spend their regular life, but these people are living a nightmare.
Since the conflict began, estimates say nearly 500,000 people have made their way to neighbouring countries in just a matter of days. Brussels is now looking to grant everyone that arrives temporary protection for up to 3 years as early as Thursday.
Member States call upon the Commission to present, to activate a temporary protection directive, which is a regulation that is tailored for a special situation with millions of people arriving, so that they can have a proper protection and proper rights. And I'm stand ready to present that for a possible decision already on Thursday.
For now, the millions of displaced Ukrainians will be looking west to the EU for any help they can get. Shona Murray, Euronews, Bucharest.
Unprecedented sanctions by Western countries have caused the Russian currency, the ruble, to crash to record lows. Restrictive economic measures imposed by the US and EU saw the ruble plunge over 40%. In response, the Bank of Russia more than doubled its interest rate to 20% in an effort to cut losses. Long queues formed over the weekend as people tried to withdraw cash. However, the Kremlin insists that it has the financial capacity to withstand sanctions. And during a meeting with his economic advisers, President Putin lashed out at the West's tactics. Well, to talk more about how much the Russian economy has been impacted so far, I'm joined by Vicky Price, Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research and a former UK Chief Government Economist. Thank you for joining us, Vicky. It's good to have you with us. We can see that these sanctions are already having an impact economically speaking. If we just take a look at the scenes that we've seen over the weekend, those long queues, ordinary Russian people trying to get their cash out. But as this goes on, how bad could it get?
Could get pretty bad for the Russians, really. I mean, the most important sanction that has been imposed so far is the freezing of the overseas assets, the foreign assets held in other countries and in foreign currency by the Russian central bank. And of course, the reason why the ruble has fallen so dramatically is because, though it did fall right at the beginning of the invasion into Ukraine, is because the central bank in Russia was using those reserves to support the ruble, and then the ruble recovered for a while, as we saw. So once you freeze the assets that are held elsewhere by the central bank, then that is much, much more difficult to do, and hence why anyone who was holding rubles would try and get out of them. So that is going to hurt them, and inflation will rise very significantly. And of course, the increase in interest rates that have just been announced is also going to affect the population at large.
And Vicky, we've also now heard that the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ will halt trading in Russian stocks. It seems like, I mean, it's a huge move. What do you think the fallout could be?
There isn't going to be the ability to raise any funding for a number of the companies that have been trading in the various stock exchanges. That was expected, more or less. And of course, they have been using the overseas markets very significantly and doing investments, of course, sometimes in other countries, but also doing quite a lot of investments in Russia. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that The earlier sanctions that have been imposed now for the last sort of 12 years by the US and the EU have had an impact, or 10 years really, have had an impact on the Russian economy anyway. And some of the calculations are that the Russian economy has grown considerably less than equivalent countries elsewhere because of the inability, if you like, to trade properly with the rest of the world. Quite a lot of equipment that it would like to have in hasn't come in. Plus, of course, the Russians themselves restricted imports too in retaliation. So I'm afraid if you add it all together, this is a real squeeze. You add the SWIFT as well, the SWIFT sanction, which is basically for a number of banks, not all of them, they are no longer able to use this messaging system for transferring money. That makes life a lot more difficult as well. Not impossible, but a lot more difficult.
Well, let's turn this around then, Vicky, because EU leaders have also been warning that there will be a price to pay on the other end. What kind of impact do you think that Russia's trading partners will feel here?
Well, the first thing, of course, is the increase in the price of oil and gas, particularly gas, which is a very significant import into Europe. And there are a number of countries in Europe, whether you look at Germany and Italy, that have been relying very significantly on gas imports. I think in Italy, the figure is 46% of all its gas comes from or is imported from Russia. And a very significant figure, something similar, if not slightly higher in Germany. So that is going to affect those countries quite significantly. And of course, oil price and gas prices are internationally traded, so it's going to affect everyone, not just the Europeans, of course. So that's one of the areas of concern. The other thing, of course, has to do with, for the moment, of course, energy exports from Russia have not been affected by the sanctions. In other words, the West has not imposed any controls or any cutbacks on those. So at least that's okay, but the price is going to be going up. The other thing is food. Wheat is very significant as part of the exports, plus loads of metals and minerals that come from Russia. So all that is going to be quite negative for growth in the West as well.
All right. Vicky Price, Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research. Thanks so much for your insights. Well, still to come, we'll be hearing from José Manuel Barroso, the former European Commission President, as Europe faces its biggest challenge since the Second World War. Join me for that.
Our world is evolving faster than ever before. In this Euronews debate, our experts will discuss how to successfully regenerate a town or region. Join me, Damon Embling, and our panellists live on Euronews.com.
The latest headlines coming up shortly on Euronews Tonight.
Welcome back. This is Euronews Tonight. President Zelensky has now signed the decree to apply for immediate EU membership. Earlier, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen told Euronews that Ukraine is one of us and we want them in the EU. But not all member states are on board, as Christopher Pitches reports.
Faced by Russia's full-scale invasion, Ukraine has signed an application for membership of the European Union. President Zelensky had previously called for Brussels to provide a cash injection and to fast-track its EU integration, something that normally takes years. But now, the process is official.
We appeal to the European Union for the immediate accession of Ukraine via a new special procedure.
And that's also the goal of the European Commission President, who in an interview with Euronews said over time, Ukraine should join the club.
We have a process with Ukraine that is, for example, integrating the Ukrainian market into the single market we do have. We have a very close cooperation. They belong to us, they are one of us, and we want them in.
But by Monday, the rhetoric had softened, with the Commission spokesperson saying that any official request would have to go to the European Council, where lengthy debates on the topic are likely.
We have heard the message from President Zelensky calling for an accelerated, fast-tracked procedure. But again, as I say, let me remind you that the Commission works on the basis of a mandate that it receives to negotiate. We do not define the mandate ourselves.
On Tuesday, MEPs will debate the matter of Ukrainian EU membership, but other countries already in the process will be watching closely and waiting impatiently to sit around this table. Christopher Pitchers, Euronews, Brussels.
Well, earlier I spoke to José Manuel Barroso, former European Commission President, about the possibility of Ukraine joining the European Union. He says that President Vladimir Putin doesn't want Ukraine to join the bloc, but the bigger issue for him is the possibility of it joining NATO.
I heard today President von der Leyen of the European Commission saying that she feels that Ukraine is one of ours. And in fact, I'm no doubt that the European Union would like to integrate as much as possible and as soon as possible Ukraine as one of its members. The question is how to do it. Of course, to become a member of the European Union has some conditions. And by the way, we should not forget that all these problems, in fact, started not because Ukraine was going to join NATO. Let's be honest about this. Everybody knows that Ukraine is not going to join NATO. There was no sufficient support for that. But in fact, what apparently President Putin does not want is a Ukraine that is more European, that wants the European way of life, that wants, in fact, to be closer to open societies, open economies. That's the point. Let's not forget that what happened in 2014, it was not because of NATO. It was because Ukrainians wanted an association agreement, not even membership. It was just an association agreement between Ukraine and European Union. And when the government at that time, the president, rejected that, there was Maidan demonstrations, and then as a response, there was the invasion of Crimea and the annexation of Crimea. So at the end, this is an issue about letting or not a people decide which way it wants to go. And if the Ukrainians want to be closer to the European Union, I think they have that right. Now, we have to see how to achieve that goal, and I believe it's in fact achievable. I think that's the way to go forward. In fact, we have seen that association agreement, in spite of all the resistance, was approved and is now in force. And in fact, there are already many areas of cooperation between the European Union and Ukraine. But of course, I think it will be justified if the European Union states that, in fact, supports fully that aspiration of Ukraine joining when it's ready, and when we will be ready, joining the European Union.
Well, amid the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as with other times of conflict, false claims and rumours are being shared deliberately. Social media platforms say they've been working to remove networks of fake accounts that are spreading disinformation. And Matthew in the Cube has been looking into it.
Indeed, Helena, long before Russian troops entered Ukrainian territory, online a war of propaganda and disinformation had been waging. It's not easy to verify claims that are being made from both sides, but something that is not in doubt is that groups of social media accounts are trying to manipulate the narrative. Meta, the big tech company that owns Facebook, has announced that it has removed a relatively small group of pro-Russian accounts that were trying to portray Ukraine as a failed state, therefore trying to portray them in the eyes of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Meta says that this group wasn't just active on Facebook, Instagram and other platforms that they own, but also other social networks like YouTube, Twitter, Telegram and other Russian social media networks. Now, they say this group has also been trying to dispel and portray disagreement within the Ukrainian government, targeting the likes of journalists as well as also military leaders. We've previously seen Facebook and others take action on these kind of accounts and disinformation campaigns. And this digital war is likely to continue because not just do you have warnings that you have cyber groups in both Belarus, an ally of Russia, and Russia itself that are trying to target Ukrainian officials. At the same time, you have other cyber groups who say they are waging a war against Russia amid their narrative about what is going on in Ukraine. And on top of this, Helena, a number of European Union member states, the likes of Poland, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, have been calling on Meta, Twitter and other big tech giants to do more, to take action against accounts of official Russian leaders and institutions and prevent them from also spreading the Russian narrative about the war in Ukraine.
All right, Matthew, covering, as you say, that digital war. Matthew, thank you so much. Well, still to come, when sport gets political, we're looking at the fallout from the war on football pitches around the world. That's after the break.
Follow the latest on the Russian-Ukraine invasion, live coverage from the key places, unfiltered, unbiased, fact-based journalism, continuing coverage on Euronews and Euronews.com.
Watch Euronews live, anytime, anywhere, on Euronews.com and the Euronews app.
This week on Euronews.
Join us for Qatar 365, the inside track on the most exciting stories from Doha and beyond. We're flying high at a falcon festival, exploring nature with a leading environmental conservationist, and it's a race to be crowned most beautiful camel. That's Qatar 365, your magazine show on Euronews and Euronews.com.
This week on Euronews.
A Dubai restaurant has launched a trailblazing project to divert used oyster shells from landfill and return them to the sea. They've teamed up with a local ecological school and marine group to use the shells to rehabilitate a natural reef system and increase biodiversity off the coast of Dubai.
All that and more, that's this week on Focus on Euronews and Euronews.com.
Welcome back. Thanks for joining us. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine is having far-reaching consequences in the world of sport. We asked sports reporter Michael Cohen what impact this will have on international organisations.
I think it's going to have a huge impact. As you've mentioned, of course, they've urged sports governing bodies not to allow Russia and Belarusian athletes to compete because of a breach of the Olympic truce by those countries' governments. And they've gone on to say that obviously the IOC, that it doesn't wish to punish competitors for the decisions of their government, but a ban is needed to protect the integrity of global sports competitions. So this would obviously mean there'd be no Russian or Belarusian athletes. We understand that the 20 Ukrainian athletes that were set to compete in the Paralympic Games haven't yet arrived in China. So of course their involvement, considering the situation, looks incredibly unlikely. But I'm sure all the other competing nations will be giving Ukraine its support, because we've already seen tremendous amount of solidarity and support from the sporting world. So yeah, lots up in the air still with what would happen with this particular Paralympic Games, but that's what we've heard so far from the IOC.
And in another case as well, Michael, we've also had FIFA coming in for quite some criticism for failing to ban the Russian international side from the World Cup qualifying. So what's the latest on that?
Yep, so there's been some advanced talks happening all day. FIFA have been in communication with UEFA about this as well. Basically, it's all about a suspension, and this would mean that Russia would not be able to face Poland in a World Cup playoff semi-final next month. And of course, it means that they basically wouldn't be able to compete at an international level for the foreseeable future. FIFA had earlier ruled that Russia could compete in those upcoming games, but it must be in neutral territory and under the title of the Football Union of Russia, with no flag and no anthem. And that certainly didn't go well at all. It wasn't received at all well. UEFA, of course, they've been in talks with FIFA as well. They're planning on removing Spartak Moscow from this season's Europa League in response. The Russian side are drawn against RB Leipzig in the last 16. There's no official confirmation from UEFA on that one as of yet, but it looks like things are going to go up a notch from FIFA.
All right, Michael, we're staying with the football then. Roman Abramovich, now he's handed over his stewardship of Chelsea Football Club to trustees, but then he's also been drafted in by Ukraine as a mediator with Russia. What a week he's had.
No, it certainly has. We heard from the billionaire's spokesman who said that basically he's been asked to come in and support their attempts to reach a peaceful resolution. And they added that Abramovich was contacted by Ukrainian officials and has been trying to help ever since. Of course, his finances would be massively affected by the economic sanctions that are being placed on Russia.
All right, you're up to date. Bye for now.
The latest headlines coming up shortly on Euronews Tonight.
This is Euronews Tonight. Here are your top stories.
Enough is enough.
As the fighting rages in Ukraine, the UN says almost 500,000 people have fled their homes, crossing the border into neighbouring countries. Seeking EU membership, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky signs an official request to admit Ukraine to the bloc, calling for his country's application to be fast-tracked. Russian forces continue shelling in almost all directions as Ukrainian soldiers resist their advance on the capital as the first round of talks between both sides on the Belarus border ends. Sanctions bite as the ruble crashes and the Russian central bank doubles its interest rate while Russians queue to get their money out.
And we look at the online war of propaganda and disinformation as pro-Russian groups are removed from Facebook.
I'm Helena Humphrey. It's good to have you with us. Ukraine has demanded that Russia pull back its forces as officials from both sides held talks for the first time since Russia's invasion began. Now, on Monday, a Ukrainian delegation, including Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov, arrived on the Belarusian border for a sit-down with Russian representatives. No major breakthrough has been made, but both parties have agreed to meet for further talks this week. President Volodymyr Zelensky says there were no preconditions ahead of the meeting. Now, he remains in the capital Kyiv, which has been under sustained attack by Russian forces. Well, fighting has entered its fifth day and Russian forces have concentrated their attack on Ukraine's main cities. Intelligence reports say that Ukraine's defensive efforts have managed to stall the invasion in some areas. The Defense Ministry says that Kyiv and the second largest city, Kharkiv, remain under Ukrainian control. Both areas have seen heavy fighting, with key strategic targets changing hands since the start of the conflict. Ukraine's Interior Ministry says dozens of people were killed by Russian rocket strikes in Kharkiv on Monday. Now, to the south, Russian forces are having more success, and the port city of Berdyansk has fallen, and the Russian army has completely surrounded the cities of Kherson and Mariupol. Well, Ukraine's Interior Ministry has updated its latest casualty information. It says 352 civilians, including 14 children, have been killed, while the number of people wounded is now over 1,600. And our correspondent Sasha Vakulina, is on the ground in Kyiv. She described the conditions people face as they try to survive in a war zone.
This is day 5, and what I've been hearing here in Ukraine, in Kyiv, in Ukrainian capital, is that people say, look, I don't know what day is it today, is it Monday, Sunday, but I do know that this is day 5. This is the feeling, this is the new reality that people all over Ukraine are living. They are bracing for anything that's coming, they're trying to stay strong. Tonight has been very tough. I myself is now in the shelter, and we have been hearing sirens going off here every 5 to 10 minutes with the messages, warnings about possible air raids, and everybody is going to seek shelter. This is this afternoon. This intensified sirens started right after negotiations were over.
We understand that people did start to emerge from their homes a little today after a weekend under curfew. And of course, I have to wonder, how are they feeling? Can they get the supplies they need? I mean, just sketch out a picture of this new reality that they're facing.
Indeed, this morning there were very long queues to the supermarkets and the pharmacies when people finally left the shelter, left their houses, trying to restock on food and water. The supermarket said that they're doing their best. Indeed, there are some products, something that is missing and not enough. Or, for example, it is not easy to find bread in supermarkets nowadays because many bakeries are not working, and those that have bakeries, the supermarkets with their own bakeries, they just cannot keep up with the demand because, of course, when people go out from their shelter today to restock on bread, food, water, medical supplies in the pharmacies. Pharmacies were open. They're not just buying it for themselves, they're also buying it for everybody who stayed in the shelter. Many Ukrainians did not go out. They just designated somebody to go and pick up food and water.
The UN's Refugee Agency says more than 500,000 people have fled Ukraine since Russia began its invasion. By Monday, 281,000 people had crossed into Poland alone. A further 35,000 fled to Hungary. Romania, Slovakia and Moldova are also seeing a huge number of people crossing the border. And Shona Murray reports from Bucharest.
As Ukrainians flee to escape war, the EU's Home Affairs Commissioner Ylva Johansson says it's preparing for the arrival of millions of civilians from there. Romania, which borders Ukraine, is one of the countries bearing the responsibility of this new refugee wave. Svetlana, who's 25, is one of the many who has had to find protection across the border.
It makes me want to cry all the time because I see what's happening in other regions. In our it's quiet, but there's like people like
the Europe will be next, the United Kingdom will be next.
Yeah, thank you.
Marina, thank you so much. That was a very clear question from Marina. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, why is the UK remaining calm and not taking real action? Richard Sheriff, what is the answer to that?
Well, firstly, thank you to Lydia and Marina. And what you say is heartrending beyond belief. And I think we all understand or try to understand the grief and the pain that you and your countrymen and women are going through. This is like a nightmare which we're living through. To the question why, what is the United Kingdom doing and why can't it do more? I think it would be fair to say that the United Kingdom has not been sitting on its hands. Clearly, I can completely understand why you feel that it is not enough. But for some 20 years, the United Kingdom has been training and supporting and equipping the Ukrainian armed forces. The United Kingdom has sent, I think, quite a significant amount of arms and ammunition and equipment to Ukraine in recent weeks. And the United Kingdom, I'm sure, will do what it can to support indirectly. But then you come to the real question, why cannot it support Ukraine directly? I guess what you're really saying is, why is the United Kingdom not putting soldiers on the ground in Ukraine?
Richard Sheriff, I want to come to that in a moment, but could we do more? Simon Fraser, you, when you were at Foreign Office, probably would have been in all of those meetings, the Cobra meetings and all the rest of it, deciding, what do we do? What would you be advising?
Yeah, well,
how would you answer that?
I would have been in those meetings. And how I answer that is to say, look, it goes partly to the whole question that we're discussing, is the UK still a global power? We have power, but we don't have the capacity on our own as a country, I think, to take on Russia militarily or to put troops, for example, on the ground in Ukraine. And so we have to work with other countries. And I would certainly have been saying we need the strongest possible alignment with America, with other Western democracies, the European Union and NATO allies to take action. And although we don't actually have a commitment to Ukraine as a NATO ally, and that is something we could debate as to whether we should actually have that commitment, but what we have seen is a pretty robust reaction by those democracies in a united way, which has certainly taken Putin by surprise. Now, it doesn't solve the problem for those people who are suffering on the ground in Ukraine at the moment, but I think at least we could say that the reaction has been, in many ways, stronger than I expected, and that is at least a relatively good point, I think, for us to take recognition of.
All right, let's come, in a way, to the point that Richard Sheriff started to address. I'm going to talk to Steve Diasher in Manchester, who I think has a point for our panel. Steve.
Yeah, firstly, I think all our thoughts are with Lydia and with all the people of Ukraine and Ukraine itself, and that we do stand firmly behind you. Being next generation man myself, this makes my blood boil just knowing how yet again we throw sanctions at Putin and he just laughs at us in our faces because it's just words, 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 and he laughs. And it means nothing to him. We cut off his assets. We cut off the SWIFT banking systems, which Putin doesn't care about because all we know he's using the cryptocurrency. That is one of those things. What is a possibility? What's not being thought about? Yet we want to put boots on the ground. We want to send people into Ukraine, but until Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, as a country, as a nation, there's not a lot we cannot do, and it's horrible because believe you me, I would put on my boots tomorrow as soon as Ukraine became a member of NATO, and I will be standing side by side on the ground, helping Ukraine and its people claim back the country. So we need to let Ukraine become a member of NATO as soon as possible.
Thank you, Steve. Marina, how do you respond to what Steve Diasher's just said about putting boots on the ground in Ukraine?
We need the help of every single person. So if someone can come and help us, we're just waiting for that help. So everyone who can come, please come and support us in every step, humanitarian help. If you can come and physically protect us, come and protect us, please.
Thank you, Marina. Aisha Hazarika, is that part of the answer here?
Well, I think a lot of people will have found it quite extraordinary that our Foreign Secretary indicated that she would support British citizens that wanted to take up that call to arms that President Zelensky setting up this international legion. She said she would support people, yet we will not put British boots on the ground. Now, we all understand the reasons that Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and we're very mindful that, you know, for NATO equipment and NATO soldiers, etc., to start attacking Russia, that takes it into another dimension. However, if President Putin, and let's be honest, he has underperformed so far, he's been humiliated by the Ukrainians' resistance and their spirit and their defiance. If he moves into using chemical weapons or using weapons of mass destruction, NATO has got to revisit the question. There may be the rules about NATO, but there's a moral question that NATO and the West will have to answer.
Richard Sheriff?
I think we need to be clear. If Britain and other NATO countries got involved directly in fighting in Ukraine, that is the start of the Third World War. No question about it. And similarly, if any attempt to impose a no-fly zone would guarantee the start of the Third World War. It is a brutal fact of life that Ukraine is not a member of NATO and therefore is not covered by the guarantee of collective defense that says an attack on one is an attack on all. So the very best that NATO can do now is to stop this any form of expansion of the war by defending NATO territory, demonstrating that it is prepared to fight to the teeth to protect NATO territory, but also to continue to support Ukraine indirectly with weapons, with equipment, potentially other capabilities as well, and also to start helping the Ukrainians prepare to fight underground if it comes to that.
Koja Koram, is that enough?
Well, I think first of all, thank you to Marina and Lydia for their heart-wrenching testimony, and full solidarity goes to the Ukrainian people for the horrors that we've witnessed them go through over the past week. But I think that the question of what that solidarity looks like relies on our idea of what is the most useful thing Britain can do to help the people of Ukraine. What's the most useful thing that Britain can do to weaken Vladimir Putin? And the horrors that we've seen in the Ukraine over the past week have prompted a long overdue conversation in the UK about why the kleptocrats that have propped up Putin's regime have used London as their base of operations.
But if we're dealing with the military question here, should we be in a position to put our soldiers into that theatre?
I think a unilateral entrance into war with Putin is not something that would be an option. We need to think about how humanitarian intervention has worked in the past, and we need to think, is there non-military tactics that could actually be more harmful to Putin than boots on the ground? And I think that that financial weakening of him is part of that.
All right. Let me go back to our viewers panel, and I'd like to talk to Emmanuel Ujungwa. Emmanuel, what is your view about what we could do?
Good evening, Trevor. I think that we knew that this was going to happen. We had the intel. We knew months ago that the war was going to happen, so it didn't take us by surprise. What is unfolding at the moment is not a surprise to us. We knew that we needed to hit Putin with sanctions, enough sanctions to make things more difficult for him. So my question to the panel is, have we really done enough? Why didn't we use the sanctions that are on at the moment to hit him hard enough to make sure that we could have prevented what was going on now?
Thank you, Emmanuel. Simon Fraser, Mr. Putin annexed Crimea in 2014. He's never made much secret of his view that he wanted to reconstruct either the Russian or the Soviet Empire, whatever he wants to call it. We could have seen this coming.
Well, we could have seen it coming, I suppose, and we could have taken it more seriously. And I think I wouldn't defend the fact that, you know, with hindsight, maybe we certainly misread him. I mean, it's a very good question that's been raised as to whether we could have done more sooner to deter this action. It's not true that we knew this was going to happen months ago. I mean, there were indications it might happen. I think that we didn't know it was going to happen until relatively recently. Again, maybe that was a misreading of Putin. And, you know, one of the great things in diplomacy and international relations is you really have to understand where your adversary is coming from. Sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that everybody thinks the same. They think about the world in the way that we think about it, and that can be a mistake. So we could perhaps have done more to deter this, impose the sanctions earlier. We were late to do what we've done. I accept that charge, actually. But on the other hand, we have moved very fast when we've woken up. We may have woken up too late, but we have woken up. And if you look at what, for example, the European Union and Germany and others have now done, it's pretty remarkable. Too late may be, but let's hope that it's not too late to actually influence Putin in the long run and damage him in the way that's been described so that we can deter him from further violent action.
OK, well, you mentioned the other European powers. So coming up, our viewers and studio panellists will be discussing if there are any leaders strong enough to stand up to Russia.
The European Union will finance the purchase and delivery of weapons.
We will invest more than 2% of our GDP in defence every year from now on.
Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Leaders of the free world, if you won't help us today, tomorrow war will be knocking on your door.
I'm Inzamam Rashid and I'm Sky's North of England correspondent, telling stories from this culturally rich region I call home.
It's going to become very similar to other places and lose its unique qualities.
It's steeped in history.
If the Taliban found your family, what would happen?
I think they're just going to straight away execute them.
There are issues of racism in all levels of cricket.
I was on the balcony a couple of times. I was nearly gone.
Football is a joy to watch, and when people are disappointed, you can feel the hate.
I just felt physically sick, so I was like, that's really in my system.
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world. Even before the pandemic, GPs were pleading for help. Government expects more face-to-face contact with patients in return.
Men, they want to force you doing something which you don't want to do, just because you're homeless and you're looking for a warm place to sleep.
We give a voice to communities often unheard and unserved from a region with a distinct history and global impact.
I love my job because I get to do something that is contributing to a better future.
Welcome back to The Great Debate, where this week we're asking, is Britain still a global power? And it's not just the UK which has responded to the attack on Ukraine. Countries around the world have condemned President Putin's actions and imposed retaliatory measures in response. But is the Russian leader taking any notice? Let's start things off with a question from our viewers panel, and I want to talk to Joni Cunningham. Joni, you're in Bristol. Please talk to us.
Hi there. I've got a quick question. Is President Putin taking advantage of a lack of leadership in European countries? There seems to be a vacuum of power. I'm wondering whether we've perhaps kind of sleepwalking into this a little bit.
And your view about this is... What's your own answer to your question?
Yeah, I do think there's been a vacuum of leadership. I feel like, maybe not current leaders, but previous leaders, I think we've been sleepwalking a little bit. I think it's been on the agenda. I'm just wondering what the panel's thoughts are on that.
Thank you very much, Joni. Well, look, Joni's question is this. Is President Putin taking advantage of a lack of leadership in European countries? Simon Fraser.
Well, I think one of the reasons why he chose to act now is because it was opportunistic. He thought that this was a moment of maximum weakness in the West. The Americans were weakened after Afghanistan, and they're very divided at home. Britain, I mean, we have domestic political problems here. And, of course, after Brexit...
Can't imagine what you're talking about.
And after Brexit as well, I think our position is unclear on a number of these things. And in Europe, we've had a change of government and coalition in Germany. President Macron is up for re-election. So for a number of reasons, there's been a lot going on. And, yes, I think it's fair to say there was unclarity and a lack of focus and a lack of leadership. But I'll make the point again that once he's taken this action, I've been positively surprised by the way that the European countries, both at national level and collectively through the EU and in NATO, have actually responded. And indeed, the European Commission, a much maligned organisation in this country, under the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has actually made some really dramatic moves in terms of announcing sanctions and extending, for example, the funding of military equipment to Ukraine in quite a significant way. So there has been a lack of leadership, but it seems to have come together recently.
Koja Koram.
So I think the points that Simon makes are really insightful, and we need to recognise that this points to the kind of illogic of Putin's plan, even on its own basis, that it resulted in a unification of NATO and a unification of the West in a way that hadn't happened for a generation. I think that the economic sanctions are welcome, but I think they can go much further. I think that we need to remember that Russia holds about half of its wealth offshore. It's an incredible level of financial exposure for a great power, one that might be unprecedented in history. And this could be an opportunity to really weaken the financial support that keeps Putin in power. And I think that that's the next step that needs to be pushed for.
All right, we'll come back to that. Let's go back to the war. Let's go to the viewers' panel. Natasha Dillon. Do you think that we have the leadership that can really challenge Putin?
Well,
he's a tough guy.
Putin is a playground bully. He's consumed by his lust for power and his desire to leave a legacy of reuniting the USSR. His words and actions have become increasingly deranged, and the West has been following its usual bureaucratic procedures in an orderly fashion. We're facing an unhinged despot with his finger on the button, and we cannot wait for sanctions to take effect. We're at a critical point in our history, and if we're too slow to act decisively, this war will have far-reaching consequences for the entire world. I think that the only leadership currently that could stand up to Putin is NATO. And I don't see why we can't allow allow Ukraine some emergency membership to NATO, because if we don't stand up to Putin now, he will not stop at Ukraine.
Thank you, Natasha. Richard Shearers, This would have fallen into your lap as the Deputy Supreme Commander of NATO.
I mean, to the question of, is there the leadership to stand up to this man? Well, the old line, cometh the hour, cometh the man or woman, and we must hope that cometh the man or woman. I can tell you somewhere that cometh the man is evident, and that is in Ukraine with President Zelensky. He has really stepped up to the mark, and I think we have to admire his courage and his charisma. I think it's too early, frankly. To the previous question from the lady from Bristol about has lack of leadership, in a sense, led to where we are now, the answer is categorically yes in the West, I'm afraid. So now it's up to, you know, this is a come-as-you-are party. We've got to do this with the leaders we've got, so we've got to hope they step up to the mark.
You're talking Johnson, Macron, Draghi, now Scholz. You're saying these guys don't have what it takes?
I'm saying we better hope they do. The jury is out. But to the point about NATO, we need to be clear about this. If NATO is to get involved on the ground in Ukraine, NATO is going to have to fight the Third World War from a standing start. What have we seen thus far? NATO has started the process of reinforcing the eastern flank with the NATO response force. It's a start, but that does not yet constitute a genuine warfighting capability, and it will take some time to generate that. Because the reality is, I'm afraid, that we have seen a decade and a half, if not longer, of cumulative disarmament in Europe, of depending on America to underpin European defence. And now, I'm afraid, the chickens are coming home to roost. Okay. So what? It's not too late. We can do something about it, but I'll let you ask somebody else another question.
Aisha Hazarika, you said a moment ago we should put boots on the ground. General Richards saying that's World War III right there.
I'm not advocating that now. I'm saying if there are practices of genocide or weapons of mass destruction or chemical weapons being used. But to the question, I think we have to be honest that leaders in Europe were completely unprepared for this on a political level, on an economic level, on a military level, on an emotional level, and a cultural level and psychological level. I think we have all been very, very naive about President Putin, and all the signs have been there. And that's because a lot of countries have been too inward-looking. You know, we in Britain have had this huge drama happening over Brexit and internal things. And what is it that we have learned from this episode? There is strength in unity. And I really hope that European leaders step up. And I think we're seeing that. But there is one other leader who could be germane in this, and that is President Xi of China. Because if we are closing off Western markets and reliance to Russia, then China is the next go-to. We know that Xi and Putin have a close relationship. China abstained at a big Security Council vote. President Xi could be key in what happens next.
Big point, and I definitely want to come back to that a little later. But let's just stick with the European territory for a moment. And I want to talk to Malcolm Severin.
I suppose my question is, would Putin have risked this if Trump was still president? He and other would-be despots knew that Trump himself was mad enough to launch his missile rather than just words. What will we face next? China invading Taiwan, North Korea invading South Korea. The point has been made, and I totally agree, we've allowed the West to be seen as very weak, and despots do not respond, well, they do respond to weakness with aggressive action.
Well, there's guys, I can see a couple of thumbs up to that. Simon Fraser, what's your view about that?
Well, if we've been better off with Trump?
Correct.
Well, I mean, interesting enough, of course, Trump came out and said that that Putin's move had been very savvy, taking over some nice territory in Ukraine. So I don't think we can take Trump too seriously. I mean, actually, Trump is largely responsible for the disunity of the West, which we've been talking about. He undermined NATO. He was aggressive and hostile towards NATO partners. He created a lot of uncertainty in the West. So I don't think he's the answer. I do agree, however, with what has been said, that what we really need is unity amongst the Western powers and Western countries, using the institutions we have, European Union, NATO and others. And we're supposed to be talking about the UK, so let's just make the point. I don't think the UK's record over the last few years in terms of being active in promoting unity in Europe is a very impressive one. And I hope we will learn a lesson from this, that we need to work with other democracies in Europe and not antagonise them.
All right, thank you very much. This is The Great Debate. Coming up, we'll hear what Ukraine's former Vice Prime Minister thinks about the international response to Russia's attack on her country.
Smile Direct Club gets you a straighter, brighter, cleaner smile.
Smile Direct Club.
This is The Great Debate. Is Britain still a global power? Before we come back to our viewers' panel, we're joined from Kyiv by Ivana Klimpoush-Tyntzadze, former Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine and current chair of the Parliamentary Committee on the Integration of Ukraine to the EU. Good evening, Ivana.
Good evening. Thank you for having me, if it's any good, because it's not good here in Ukraine.
Well, I was going to ask you to just start by telling us what is the mood tonight in Kyiv? What are you hearing? What are you seeing?
The mood is pretty tough because we've had some very serious rockets being just sent over the city, and we had several major blasts around the city. And also what we are seeing right now is that you were just discussing in your program about the nuclear threat, and I'm just going to tell you that Russian airplanes, after Russians have occupied territory where the Chernobyl nuclear power station is, they right now are flying over it and sitting there are shooting directly at Kyiv, and we cannot respond because we are worried that this way we will be shooting at nuclear power station. So you might underestimate the nuclear threat is much, much closer. Even from that fact that Putin has announced that he is going to put his nuclear deterrence on alert.
Is it your concern that there may be, in the midst of all of this, inadvertently, without anybody meaning for it to happen, a nuclear accident?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, as Putin and his army are targeting not only the critical infrastructure objects, but among them already several electric power stations, and somewhere there we do have atomic power stations across the country, so they might hit into one of those. Moreover, as I mentioned, Chernobyl is under their control at this particular moment, and we are not receiving, and MAGATE is not receiving any information on what the radiation situation is there in this particular moment.
We were, as you heard, discussing at the end of the last part, the question of the European action, European support. Do you think you could have had more help faster from the EU, from Britain, and from the United States?
Absolutely. I think if we wouldn't have postponed the actions that we were asking for 8 years since the war of Russian Federation has started against Ukraine in the east of Ukraine and in the with the illegal, totally annexation of Crimea, if at that point the sanctions were not pitiful that the West has taken, and if you were